Today, we will be reviewing at least a portion of the legendary The Serfs versus JF debate. Let's find out. JF or Jean-Francis Gariepi, legendary, kind of an alt-right dude, and Lance from The Serfs, a guy who we've talked to. We are definitely not biased in favor of either of these people beforehand. Stop!
Communist and socialism.
Capitalism versus socialism, and we're starting right now with JF's opening statement. Thanks for being with us, JF. The floor is all yours.
It's a pleasure to be here. We've talked to a lot of communists and socialists before.
That's true.
So today I'm standing again for capitalism, and mostly I will be asking to the serfs, does he have a plan for certain problems that I perceive in socialism? For those of you who know me, those will be repeat problems, but I'd like to hear our debate opponent tonight respond to these questions. The first thing is, are we acknowledging that humanity is a biological system? Are we acknowledging that the theory of evolution is true? Are we acknowledging that people are making more babies or less babies according to the characteristics that they have? This, to me, is a truth of life, but I don't know if my opponent denies it. To me, this...
So, the reason why JF turned down JF's audio, he makes me want to die. Okay, yeah, there we go. I turned it down a little bit. So, this may seem like a very confusing opening statement from JF, but it actually makes sense if you understand his beliefs. So, what JF is doing is he is actually attempting to plant in the audience the belief that socialists don't account for human nature when they make their political prescriptions. Now, I have never met a socialist who didn't believe in biology, but this is going to lead into another set of arguments. One will JF will argue, well, there are a number of things. He could argue basically any human nature position, that human beings are naturally tribalistic and that an egalitarian society wouldn't function, that human beings are naturally greedy, that human beings naturally crave order and hierarchy. He's trying to plant the seeds in the audience's mind to lead them to believe that a person who denies any of these human nature arguments is so ridiculous that they might as well deny evolution itself. At least that's what I'm reading into what he's saying. I think that's what he's trying to go for.
This is a simple fact of species on the earth. They evolve, they change, and they favor certain forms, and they obtain certain directions through evolutionary pressures. They become something. Now, once you realize this, you realize that any system ultimately will be an evolutionary system. Any political management plan for a society will be ultimately evolutionary. And although it's a more sensitive word, ultimately what it means is that everyone is participating to a form of eugenics, whether it's unintentional or intentional. Eugenics is happening. And so to someone who tells me, I'm not a eugenicist, I will show you a bad eugenicist. Ultimately, you are influencing what society becomes and how people evolve. You just don't want to acknowledge it, or you don't want to recognize it, but ultimately you do. Now, the problem once you...
So, again, this may also feel like a really weird opening argument, but the reason why he's doing this is because by conflating all types of political advocacy as different forms of eugenics, he gives himself a pass for the more extreme forms in the future. Basically, if you say, oh, well, you know, everything we do is eugenics. All political decisions affect which groups get to procreate and which groups don't get to procreate. We're all deciding who comes out on top. Then some of the more extreme examples of eugenics stop being categorically different, and they start only being different in terms of their severity, which is easier to argue down.
You realize that this is the state of humanity, that we will always be an evolutionary species, at least as long as we're engaged in baby making, is the fact that evolutionary systems converge, especially when you start giving to certain features, especially when you start rewarding certain features, and especially when you start adopting a needs-based approach. If we were to go in a park and look at the squirrels and start feeding all of the squirrels according to their needs rather than their ability to gather nuts, we would find ourselves in 1,000,000 years from now, or maybe in 100 years from now, with a bunch of fat squirrels incapable of caring for themselves, incapable of gathering in nature the foods that they need.
Okay. So now he's making a common argument against the welfare state, though it's being argued a little bit inarticulately. The argument is basically that if you give people things, they become lazy. But this isn't necessarily an evolutionary argument, because the systems that allow species to evolve are also systems that regulate the means by which they acquire resources. After all, if the squirrels all became lazy and obese and whatever, they wouldn't be able to forage for more nuts, and then they would all die off. So, unless the argument here is that the existence of the welfare state will literally lead to humanity dying off because they're no longer willing to work, something which isn't happening in countries with more of a welfare state, it seems sort of like an odd argument to make. I don't know if this one needs to be like an evolutionary argument.
There's a very simple approach to this. It's sometimes you'll see little signs that will say, don't feed the birds or don't feed the squirrels. By not feeding the squirrels, we're trying to leave the evolutionary pressures go onto the birds or squirrel population so that they don't become incapacitated by too much caring, by too much giving.
Safe.
And one of the fundamental issues with socialism, it's not the only one, but it's so grave that it's not fixable in my view, is the fact that its eugenic function is poor. It is poor because of the needs-oriented approach of socialism. Capitalism has its own way to exclude those who are unable to produce. If you don't make money in some way, if you don't produce something that some other people are willing to pay for, you would have less money and you would have less resources. And although it's not the case in our current society, because our current societies are not fully capitalistic, but in principle, in a fully capitalistic society.
Look how bewildered Lance looks, by the way. Like, for this entire conversation, look at how hard his eyebrows are raised. He's like... Anyway, yeah, so this is, again, it's a common anti-welfare argument. Like I said, he's basically just saying, if we do good things for poor people, they will be lazy and they won't work, and that's bad for society. But making this an evolutionary argument, making this a genetics argument, has much more sinister connotations down the line. Because he's not just saying that people need a proper incentive to work. He's saying that there is an imperative to keep, like, the genetic stock pure of people who do not themselves work. It's not just saying welfare makes people lazy. It's saying the existence of welfare denies us the ability to cull people who are too lazy to function in society. It's a one step above argument. That's why he opened by saying that everybody is actually eugenicist. He's making a eugenics argument right now, but by preempting, by accusing his opponent of also believing in a form of eugenics, he is annulling himself to that criticism a little bit.
But in principle, in a fully capitalistic society, you would be essentially dying off from not having resources at all and having little babies. The problem is if you don't have that kind of eugenic function, if your policy is let's give to everyone according to how much they need, which socialism does in one way or another, whether it's through some kind of universal check, some kinds of food distribution to the people or service distribution to the people, you are creating an infinitely reproductive needs function. That is, people are draining your calories, they're making babies with it. They haven't proven that they were capable of gathering those calories. You have just given them through the hand of the government. And eventually you find yourself in the next generation with more poor people, more unable people who are more dependent on the government. And who knows?
So the easy counter to this one is that the people who are most dependent on the government are the poor in terms of like their per capita, welfare allotments. And the best way to prevent that from being the case is to make them not poor, which welfare does. We already have countries that have strong welfare states, and they actually have higher degrees of income mobility. And people still work in those countries. So Lance's argument here is empirical. What JF is saying, that welfare allows the degenerately unproductive to fester, just doesn't seem to be true.
How much time it takes before this system reaches the end. History actually seems to demonstrate to us that it only takes less than 100 years before these systems crash. But it could take more than 100 years, and perhaps a communistic or socialistic society can be stable for 200, 300, 500 years. But what we know
aren't wealthy people technically more reliant on the government since they wouldn't be able to make their money without roads, education, etc.? The mechanisms by which people make money will disproportionately affect the wealthy, but those are ways that wealth is multiplied. In terms of ways in which wealth, like, sinks, it's to the poor. Poor people, because of the scales of production, because of a number of really complicated social factors, poor people are, generally speaking, a drain on the economy. Like, think of all the money that goes towards locking up the poor, all the money that goes towards resources necessary to police those communities, all the money that we lose because they're poorly educated, all the money that we lose because they don't apply themselves, because there are no opportunities in their area, so they have nothing to do but rely on welfare. Poverty is like a drain on countries. The idea that the country benefits by keeping people in a sort of Ayn Randian poverty gladiatorial arena where only like the smartest and luckiest survive is just not true. Generally speaking, more wealth is produced when you allow people the basic amenities of life.
Is that at some point you're going to reach the problem that you are allowing the multiplication of needs while not incentivizing the addressing of needs. You're not incentivizing it the way capitalism does. How does it do it? Capitalism incentivizes it by saying, if you find a way to address the needs of people, you're going to get money and you're going to be able to use that property in whatever way you want, including the ability to make babies. Communism and socialism do not do this. They incentivize inability. They incentivize people begging to the state without delivering to society. And therefore, socialism is bound to fail in some term, whether it's short or long.
The interesting thing here is that under capitalism, the opposite is the case. Wealthy, successful families in capitalist countries tend to produce fewer children than poor or less successful families. It's actually the opposite of what he's saying. Generally speaking, the wealthier and more educated you are, you hold off on having children. So his argument here is like dead on arrival. Anyway, there are many empirical arguments that Lance can counter with, so let's see how well he organized his points and responded.
You got it. Thank you very much, JF, for that opening statement. And we will kick it over to Lance. But first, want to say, folks, if it's your first time here at Modern Day Debate, we are a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And we hope you feel welcome no matter what walk of life you are from. So thanks for being with us. And Lance, the floor is all yours.
I just want to quickly say I will address all the points you brought up, but I just have a prepared statement, so I was going to use that for my first 5 minutes, if that's all right.
As you wish.
All right. So when the last drop of monarchist blood had been spilt at the end of the French Revolution in 1799, the estates were converted into a national assembly, bringing an abolition to feudalism, state control of the Catholic Church, and for the first time, the ability to vote in a democracy. Promises were made of égalité, fraternité, and most importantly, liberté. Thus began not only the age of classical liberalism, but the age of capitalism. Capitalism has been the prevalent economic system for the past 400 years, despite the promises of equality and liberty. Marx and Engels were able to observe how capitalism at its very core requires the exploitation of labor in order to be profitable. This isn't a matter of debate. In order to make money selling widgets, you first have to sell the widgets for more than you pay the...
So, already there's an issue here. Lance had a prepared statement for socialism. The problem is, JF didn't challenge socialism. JF challenged the welfare state. There are capitalist countries that have welfare states. So all of the stuff about like labor exploitation, surplus value, capital ownership, those things weren't really addressed by JF. This isn't going to be a debate about capitalism versus socialism. This is going to be a debate essentially between feudalism and social democracy. So yeah, it's unfortunate because this often happens when you're talking about socialism versus capitalism debates because nobody has any idea what socialism is. So it's very frustrating. But I understand the desire to continue with your opening statement.
Workers who build them. This is what creates different classes in society between those who hire workers and the workers themselves. We've had several dynamics like this in human history: master and slave, lord and serf, and now we have employer and employee. Not that the advent of capitalism got rid of the other dynamics. In fact, they formed hybrids. Capitalism didn't appear in its final form from the very beginning. There was other versions like mercantile capitalism, which is essentially a form of usury. Various forms would appear and die off like economic systems before them. Modern forms of capitalism include both the Industrial Revolution and the riches brought to it by the white race through the North Atlantic slave slave trade. I use the term white race because it was colonizers who invented the concept of race in order to justify the subjugation of African slaves that they brought over to the Americas to work both in cotton picking in the South and textiles in the North. Hundreds of years of slavery combined with capitalism amassed vast amounts of wealth for a certain subset of Americans. It then evolved again with the invention of corporations, which could insulate the owner from the legal liabilities of his company. Corporate institutions have grown to be the dominant economies of the planet, many surpassing the GDP of entire countries. As these corporations grow under capitalism, they also consume competing companies in the form of mergers and acquisitions, creating complete monopolies in certain fields. And while it may be tempting to insinuate that J.F. Gerepi is unable to read his copy of Mein Kampf because the pages are currently stuck together with his own cum, or that hatred of socialism and communism is because one of the most famous philosophers of those was Jewish, it should be pointed out that it's no surprise that a proud ethno-nationalist would endorse an economic system whose final form is fascism. After all,
Okay, hold on. I love the memes, but I don't actually like this as a response. A lot of the like socialist posturing in here, because it's not a response to anything that JF said, it just comes off like virtue signaling, because I guarantee you JF's not going to address any of what he's saying right now. He's going to go right back to the welfare state stuff. Like, it's good content, and that's why he wants to read it, because he wrote it out, and it's good content. But adaptability is a big part of rhetoric, so I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of that. This is his opening statement, it's not a response. Yeah, but it's an opening statement on a subject that they're not going to discuss. Also, yeah, I wonder about the poisoning the well here. I feel like when you're having a discussion in a semi-formal format like this, you should probably wait a little bit before, like, your Mein Kampf pages are stuck together with semen. I don't know, maybe. We'll see how hard the debate gets poisoned with time.
The dictatorial regimes of Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler all followed a set pattern, an authoritarian salvation of the capitalist system resulting in their oversight over its industries, a longing return to the mythical glory of their empires, a vilification of an entire people as a scapegoat, Catalonians or Jews, a distrust for the lying press, and finally the expansion of Leipzig or promised land in the form of settler colonialism. Corporations have no loyalty to their country of origin. Their loyalties are exclusive to producing profit for the shareholders. This can be seen in a company like IBM that is actually complicit in the Holocaust, developing the cataloging system necessary for the mass organization of the Jewish genocide. If one is to advocate for modern-day capitalism, they are also advocating for corporate dictatorships whose decision-making rests within a small handful of board members and CEOs. As I stated previously, these companies will devour one another until they have complete monopolistic control in their field. It's for this reason today that in America, 9 banks control the majority of wealth and assets we depend on, 8 food companies control all the products you see in the grocery store, 5 media companies control all the movies, television, and radio podcasts we listen to, 3 technology companies control the vast majority of social media in the world, 2 companies produce the vast majority of beer in America. Under our capitalist system, 6 men own the collective wealth of 7 billion people. The myth of a purely meritocratic system in which people advance solely on their talent wouldn't justify this disgusting inequality even if it was true, which it isn't. Capitalism is now resulting in the ecological disaster that threatens all life on Earth, yet the ability to stop CO2 output while pushing for an endless growth in a system with finite resources will eventually meet its catastrophic end. I'm sure it's inevitable that we will discuss the trillions of lives lost at the hands of the communists in China or Russia, but what I will be proposing here today is to look to other economic systems, both from the past and present, and analyze and adopt what is most beneficial to the vast majority of humanity. Any mature conversation about these topics should avoid playing team sports to previous ideologies and ascertaining which aspects are the most beneficial to everyone. In this, I state that no economy is completely giving workers over the control of their own production, and that a starting point for us to achieve that in our current system is through the implementation of worker cooperatives and worker unions. The Italian region of Emilia-Romagna is where 1/3 of the GDP is successfully produced through worker co-ops, and the 5th largest umbrella corporation in Spain, known as Mondragon, are 2 examples of such systems working efficiently. Now, I may just be a low IQ individual, but that doesn't take a lot of brain horoscopes to know the simple fact that our understanding of the universe evolves over time. Alchemy gave way to chemistry, as astrology gave way to astronomy, so too can our economic system evolve to one that is more democratic, more efficient, less exploitative, and better for every member of the human race.
You got it. Thank you very much, Lance.
Okay, yeah, so as an opening statement, I'm not a big fan of this. It's the reason why, I never do any opening statements that I've prepared myself as well. Because I feel like you always have to adapt to the situation at hand. JF came off affable in his opening statement. As reprehensible as a human being as he is, he did come off affable, like he's just, has a couple of questions about socialism and how society could function with it. So the aggression in the response isn't something that I think is rhetorically effective to like an imagined neutral party, which is what I'm always trying to appeal to, I think. And also this, yeah, like JF isn't going to address anything that was just said. He's going to be like, okay, you didn't answer my questions, I bet. So we're going to move out from there. We'll see actually how JF responds to this.
For that opening statement as well. We are going to jump into the open conversation, folks. I want to remind you we have many juicy debates coming up. As you can see, for example, at the bottom right of your screen, we are thrilled as on June 9th, Apostate Prophet and Dr. Michael Brown will be debating whether or not there's a God. You don't want to miss.
Wait, it is just that you say at the beginning of stream, you said the mass bombardment information is bad. Well, wait, the only time it's okay to gish gallop is in an opening statement. That's the time that it's okay to gish gallop. But it's important that those statements be relevant because, you know, this is the one time it's acceptable. You're basically laying out the entirety of your argument and then you substantiate it over the course of the debate. I just don't think that we're going to have an opportunity to substantiate any of that because talking about two different things.
Miss it, so hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's going to be epic. And with that, we're going to kick it into open dialogue mode. Gentlemen, thanks so much, and the floor is all yours.
All right, so perhaps I can just return to my initial questions to...
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean.
The serfs or Lance or the serfs, is that how are you
either works. Yeah, no, Lance is
Okay.
good, serfs is good, doesn't matter.
All right, so my initial question was, so do we agree that humanity is a biological species with evolutionary forces, with natural selection applying to it?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so do you understand the parallel between, say, population of squirrel that I would feed constantly, no matter how good they are at gathering nuts? And do you understand that ultimately I would drive this population to become unable to do the gathering that they should do to survive on their own?
So this is the first time I've heard squirrel theory. I've heard Jordan Peterson propose this with lobsters before. I would like to start to say that eugenics is a bad thing, and I don't think we should participate in it. And I haven't heard anyone use it as a way of defending capitalism yet. But I will say this in relation to squirrels. Almost all animals on the planet, with the exception of humans, are engaged in something known as homeostasis, in which they will basically have an equilibrium with the world around them. And that includes squirrels. For example, if you put a whole bunch of rats in a cage and you give them a finite amount of food, they will stop reproducing as the food supply goes down. That's something that most people engage in. Humans are unique to this planet in the sense that we continue to excavate and exploit and expand upon the planet despite...
This is a good counter-argument from Lance, and it's true. When we're talking about the distribution of resources, comparisons between humanity and other animal species don't necessarily work because we've broken natural selection. We don't engage in natural selection in the same way other species do. We have, in many ways, completely superseded the natural demands and expectations of this planet. Many of the greatest signifiers of success evolutionarily are ones which no longer lead us towards fertile reproduction, which is again the reason why the most educated, wealthy, and safest among us tend to have fewer children than people who live in like poor farming communities in the third world. So these systems aren't necessarily applicable. I think that what Lance should do is fundamentally reject any comparisons between human organization and animal organization with regards to resource distribution. And then he should use empirics. He should talk about how we have welfare states that do not conform to these rules he's ascribing, but they still work.
That could result in the detriment of all our lives.
Exactly. So don't you see the problem in giving in that most consuming species? And I agree with you that we are a species at very high disequilibrium with nature. But don't you think, therefore, it is the worst species that you could possibly feed for free?
Where does the free part come into this? Because have we moved past the squirrels? Are we on to squirrels to humans now?
Yeah, we're talking about humans. And okay. I'm guessing that some aspect of your socialistic project must be to address the needs of the people. Maybe you should define what is socialism in your view.
Sure, absolutely. So socialism is the worker control over the means of production and distribution. And in my proposal that I've laid out here, it's not going to handle the second part, but it's going to meet the first part. And in that, I want to expand democracy. The same way that you have democracy in your ability to vote for your elected leaders, I want the same democracy to be expanded into the place where you spend 8 hours of your day, every single day working in your job. So I think people in their jobs should have democratic control and say in their own positions.
And so do you think that these democratically controlled production lines will be more efficient?
They are more efficient, yeah. Most studies that have looked at the efficiency rates of worker cooperatives compared to traditional capitalist enterprises have shown that they are typically more efficient and less wasteful than their counterparts.
And I guess that you're going to tell me what most communists come here to tell me, that they're more efficient, but they're not successful because there's a conspiracy against you guys in the banking system.
So, hold on. What we've demonstrated right now is a very funny hypocrisy. Because JF opened with that same argument, societies collapse because of welfare states, then why are there welfare states implemented in almost every capitalist country on Earth? Even America has government-operated systems of welfare. We have food cards, we have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid. So JF's argument is equally conspiratorial. Actually, welfare systems and feeding the poor, they lead to the collapse of civilizations within a century. And actually, the reason why every country on Earth that has a welfare state is doing just fine is because of see, it goes both ways, you know?
No, I wasn't going to throw that in there. But if we're doing the brackets, I mean, I'd probably pivot back to the fact that they have the same rate statistically of decay as their capitalist counterparts. They don't have the same rate of birth. So that means that they do not start up as often as capitalist companies do. However, they fail at the same rate as capitalist companies. So if they were given the right or given the ability to start up on a regular basis, they would be just as efficient, more efficient than their capitalist counterparts, but they would die or decay at the same rate.
Now, what proportion of the population do you think it's important to them to be in control of their working place, and what proportion just doesn't care about it?
Well, I don't think most people are aware of the ideas I'm proposing, which is why I'm trying to tell them on bigger platforms. So I don't think if I polled the average American...
So, hold on. This is a trap question right here, okay? Most people don't care about their workplaces right now because they don't have to, because people in their workplaces have no control over where they work. This would be like asking a 16th century European peasant how much they actually care about how their government operates. It's a non-question, and it's not an argument against democracy. You can make the same argument about democracy. Well, how many people actually care? Well, it doesn't matter. Even if not a single one of them cared, democracy would still be preferable. And as it turns out, most of them care once you give them the tools and the reason to care.
They would tell you that what they're looking for in their job is ownership over their own production. They would probably tell you they're looking for financial security for their friends and their family, and that's important to everybody. But in terms of what percentage should be, I am advocating for every single job to be worker controlled.
Against the will of the people. Let's say there's a part of the economy that tells you we want to stay capitalistic. Our workers are perfectly fine with this. You would object to discontinuing it to exist?
So I like the language JF just used there. What if a portion of the population agreed? What if their workers were fine with traditional organization? I.e., what if the CEOs objected? Kind of giving away that he doesn't really care about democracy there, you know? Oh, sure, you can make England and France democratic, but, you know, what if the leaders of Italy and what have you, what if they don't want to go democratic? What if Canada wasn't going to go democratic, you know? Kind of a silly retort.
I'm not forcing it upon anyone, though. I'm not saying that this has to come down from the government on high or that there has to be some kind of Stalinistic regime that forces people to do things against their will. I'm saying that this is what I'm advocating for. Whether or not people choose to do this is something that I hope that I can spread by telling this message to more people.
All right. Well, I don't severely object against worker co-ops. I'm kind of enthusiastic about the fact that there are certain banks in Quebec that were worker co-ops. They turned out to be not so well managed and offering fees that became uninteresting with time. But I mean, in a capitalistic society, there's every ingredient needed for you guys to thrive as much as nature allows. And if you find your workers who are interested in building these projects, you should get them. And if you are right about the increased productivity, which I personally doubt, but as long as you're doing it without forcing it on people and with your own funds, I don't object to worker co-ops existing, really.
So I think then the burden of proof would be on you to defend the current paradigm that we have, which is that CEOs in America, on average, make about 325 times the rate of pay as their employees, and that we have a system now in which most workers don't have democratic control in their jobs. So we're talking about an environment where you spend 8 hours of your day and you have no say as to what happens in your job. That, to me, is a fundamental problem, and that's one of the broken parts of our current system.
Well, to me, it's not a fundamental problem. And to me, I think it shows a secret that a worker co-op or a socialistic system will never reach in terms of the mechanism of a capitalistic society and why ultimately it wins, why it creates so much wealth that that even a poor worker in a capitalistic society ends up making more money than a rich one in a socialistic one. Ultimately, it boils down to the allocation of that. Well, just compare America compare a worker in America in the 60s to someone in the USSR.
Sure. You said a rich one, though. So you said that a worker in America is making more than a rich person in a quote.
I'm not telling you won't find a single one in the USSR who's not richer than a McDonald worker. Of course, you will find this because communism is the accretion of power to central entities, and therefore there are lots of paths for corruption open. But in general, the amount of wealth that was created by American society surpasses any sort of worries around the division of it. In other words, I end up being richer today because Facebook is so rich and because there are these central entities that are making even more. And yet my life is great today because these big entities exist. But anyways, going back to what you asked me.
Okay, so you asked me to define socialism. Can you define communism for me?
Well, to me, communism is some kind of accomplished form of socialism. So I use the words interchangeably, but we're talking about
like
control
Marx.
over the means of production. And I tend to try to use socialism for meaning a part of the means of production have been taken over, and communism meaning it's been taken over in full. But then the in full, the definition of the in full is very relative. For example, as far as I'm concerned, the means of production have been taken over so much in countries like Canada and the US that we've attained communism at this point. So relative. For example, as far as I'm concerned, the means of production have been taken over so much in countries like Canada and the US that we've attained communism at this point.
We did it, boys! Hey! Congratulations, everybody! I thought we had a little bit more to go. I guess the finish line was further back than I expected. Nice! Then why was he saying that a worker in a capitalist country makes more than a worker in a communist country if he thinks America is communist, but he used America as an example of the capitalist country in the dichotomy? What? This is completely incoherent. Yeah. He said 1960s. He said Canada? Didn't he say America too? Oh, right. They're Canadian. I forget. It remains incoherent. 1960s America.
So I can define.
Also, wait. Wasn't the welfare state more robust back in the 1960s? Back then, that was after we had Social Security, we had Medicare and Medicaid. I'm pretty sure there was more taxation on the wealth. A greater proportion of that wealth was spent. Yeah, I think, yeah, with the Great Society and everything. Yeah,
Define it for you. It's a moneyless, classless, stateless society. So we have not really had a true communist government in human history.
No, and you won't, because if you centralize power that much, you will have.
Wait, JF is like, actually, these governments, they are all communist to me. And then Lance is like, actually, we haven't had any communist governments. And JF is like, I know we don't, and you never will, because what? This is why I really, really, really hate arguments over what communism and socialism are, and I would rather just talk policies. Because, oh my god, having conversations about, like, broader ideological goals. Oh, man.
Classes.
Right, but I think your umbrage might be with, say, Stalinism or something of that nature. Is this what you're?
Well, no, his issue isn't with Stalinism. His issue is with social welfare. So JF is more of a libertarian-leaning Nazi. JF's goal for an ethno-state isn't to have like some rigid top-down autocratic authority dictating racial separation. His goal is to use the mechanisms within capitalism to financially incentivize ethnic separation. I've listened to him talk a couple of times. It seems like he leans into the like more into the like using corporate control and unequal economic outcomes to enforce ethnic policy than total autocracy. At least that's what he says sometimes. It's really hard to tell. It seems a little bit idiosyncratic sometimes. I don't know.
Trying to associate this with?
Well, no, not even that. I take issue with control, democratic control, state control, and worker control if it is done against the will of what is being controlled. So going back to what you mentioned about the inequality.
How can you be against democracy? Because it's against the will of the people. Isn't democracy by definition more for the will of the people than any other system you could implement? Like, if you give people democracy and they don't want that system of democracy, couldn't they use the democracy to democracy their way into a different system? Yeah, this is literally, what if the people want to be oppressed?
Of our societies. I don't take, it's not a problem for me, and it doesn't change the path of my life. If I look at the progression between my great-grandfather to me, it really doesn't change our lives that McDonald is 100 times richer than us or 1 billion times richer than us. It really doesn't matter.
Because you're not poor.
Well, I've been as poor as someone can be. I mean, I've been in the streets, I've been without locations to live, I've been without jobs, and I've been with $0 in my account. So I don't.
Also, I slightly dislike Lance's answer here. It doesn't matter whether you're poor or wealthy. There's only so much money in the economy. I'm not saying that it's a closed system, but if $1 billion are going towards, CEOs, that is money that under different systems would be going to workers that could then use that money to buy products, which would enrich even the upper middle class or the petite bourgeois. Everyone has a hand in where money goes, which is the reason why the ultra-wealthy care so much about making sure so little money goes to the workers under their employ.
You can tell I'm not poor right now. And yes, I've been successful on YouTube, but I know what being poor is. And really, it doesn't change my view of capitalism. Even when I was poor, it's not a lack of empathy that I have with poor, or a lack of understanding with poor people here. It's a principled stance that I'm taking today.
Sure. So in the case of Jeff Bezos, how much more does he make than the average worker in terms of like compensation?
I don't know. And
he makes
really doesn't matter.
He makes about $9 million an hour. So that's over hundreds of thousands of times what his average worker makes. Wouldn't you have to justify, because this
Wait, 9 million an hour? Is that true? Hold on. Jeff Bezos wage per hour. About $150,000 a minute. 150,000 times 60. Yeah, that's $9 million an hour. All right. Of course, he doesn't actually get a wage. He gets stock options that increase in value, but,
This is you proposing this, that he justifiably works hundreds of thousands of times more than his average worker in order to receive that compensation.
Because work time is not the unit of contributions to society. In other words, you can work all your life and produce less for society than Jeff Bezos could produce in a second.
Mm-hmm. But that doesn't justify whether or not he gets paid that much more than his workers do, does it?
Well, what do you mean by justify? Because it seems that embedded in your concept of justification is the assumption that work hours is the unit of contribution to society.
No, I'm saying that if you work, you should be compensated for your work. I think that's something that we both agree on. At least I hope so.
Yes, and is there anyone working at Amazon who's not getting compensated for their work?
But are they being compensated adequately for the work? I mean, in the case of Amazon, if you're showing up there and you're risking your life and you're getting COVID and then you're actually having to shit and piss in bags, I would say, and I would posit this, that maybe getting $15 to $17 an hour doesn't justify that kind of lifestyle, and that maybe we should be paying them more. Maybe they should have more rights. Maybe they should be unionized. They can fight up against the pissing and shitting in bottles and cans.
So notice, again, this isn't actually a conversation about socialism. Social democrats will make the same arguments against the extreme accumulation of wealth at the hands of the 1%. So these conversations are always a little bit difficult because they always boil down to what people actually deserve, and I don't know if that's ever a rhetorically effective road to go down, because what something or somebody deserves is really, really, really complicated. I think it's generally better. I think one of the things you have to do is you have to argue its arbitrarity. So you can argue that the CEO of Amazon is a position which, by its incredible weight and importance, warrants a tremendous amount of income. But wouldn't that be like saying you arbitrarily create a job position of like God, Emperor, King, and anybody in that position is super mega duper important, and therefore they need to make $1 bajillion trillion every year in order to justify their importance? But you created the position. The position of a CEO is a created position. It's not some natural phenomena that needs exist. They aren't a spirit that needs to be placated with sacrifices of virgins into volcanoes. There's an arbitrarity here. We construct these systems, and there are ways that you can demonstrably show how the incredible overaccumulation of wealth in the hands of Bezos and other people like Bezos does harm to society, that our infrastructure is crumbling, that people aren't able to get the healthcare they need, that people in other countries have access to better, amenities than they do here in the States. And then you run into the fundamental problem. JF does not believe people deserve things just by way of existing. You know, Lance can make all these empirical arguments about how life could be better for basically everybody if Jeff Bezos were taxed more, and then JF counters, well, I don't actually care if life is better for these poor people, because if it was, a society would be denied the eugenic element that makes it great. So that's the fundamental argument. JF has already argued against the concept of equality. That's what Lance needs to address at its root. In fact, I bet you that if we continue watching, I don't know if it'll take 5 minutes or 30, but eventually that's the juxtaposition they're going to arrive at, you know?
Maybe they can. I mean, they can if they want, really. As long as they're voluntarily working for the salary they're given and they're accepting to piss in the bottle, so be it. I will not intervene in a third-party relationship in which people are voluntarily submitting 8 hours of their day to something else in exchange of money.
But do you think it's voluntary? Because if you don't have a job in America, you probably don't have healthcare. And if you don't have healthcare, you might die. And if you don't have a job, you can't pay rent or eat. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily voluntary. It's kind of like you're coerced out of survival.
Well, the state of default of humanity is to be faced with the natural elements. So I'm not going to start seeing the employers that...
So this is, of course, a fallacious argument. The natural state of humanity is to face the natural element. This is a completely meaningless statement.
Offers a cover from the natural elements, that offers an option to these people. I'm not going to start seeing him as the evil person, because the fact is, if Jeff Bezos wasn't there, and if all of the capitalists weren't there, and if all of...
Notice now he's turning this into a moral question. Is Jeff Bezos evil? Now, to my memory, Lance never actually said Jeff Bezos is evil and that's why this is bad. Did he say that at any point? I don't think he said that. This is a very common argument from anti-communists. They will ascribe moral value to condemnations of economic inequality. I don't care if all the wealthy people on Earth are super-duper awesome humanitarians. And I don't care if all the poor people on Earth are super-duper mean, I don't know, Satanists or whatever. We're not arguing about individual moral worth. We're just arguing about fair systems.
Of the companies weren't there, these people would just be in the forest, literally running for their lives. And so, no, I'm not going to see the employer relationship as an extortionist one, when in fact, in this relationship, all that Jeff Bezos gives is an option.
Are they in the forest looking for nuts or squirrels, or how does that work?
Well, they'd be in the forest, potentially running away from other tribes or running away from natural predators.
Collecting nuts, I guess.
But you're trying to make a joke and it really doesn't connect.
No, I'm not. I'm actually asking. I'm very confused by this. You're the first person who's ever proposed
humans
this kind of idea. They do, but I don't understand how the idea of survival in the animal kingdom is in any way related to economic systems for modern society that we're trying to propose here.
Here it is. Here is how it's connected. Do you think that there are some human families that make more babies than others?
Of course there is.
Do you think that therefore their genes are more present in the next generation as opposed to the other families that made less babies?
See, genes. These are genetic arguments. The idea that, like, we're trying to weed out the gene pool of the degenerates who can't work.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other factors to contemplate there, but sure. If one person has 1 kid and one person has 10 kids, that person with 10 kids will have more genes in the gene pool.
So if there are a bunch of genes that make you such that, 1, you don't produce anything for society, but 2, you can beg as well as others, and in fact better.
Ah, yes, the begging for resources but not working gene. Yes, of course.
Than others for governmental support. Do you think that this might cause a problem on evolutionary timescales?
Again, keep in mind, and Lance really needs to point this out, this argument is self-evidently false. The wealthiest people in this country produce fewer children than the poorest people. If you want people with dysgenic genes to have fewer children, you would want to make them middle class. Now, so assuming, by the way, that this idea is correct, that if you're poor, it's because your genes make you poor, which, again, he couldn't substantiate if he tried, the idea that our society is great because the most productive people have the most children is factually not true. So Lance needs to point that out.
If the government was to start feeding these families with everything they need to survive and make further babies, further higher numerous babies.
Good.
Right, but then the solution to your problem would just be to have as many kids as possible. Like, wouldn't it just be if you just fuck a ton and have 30 kids, you're going to win at my strange scenario?
Well, that would be the solution from the perspective of a human wanting to undermine the system. But this human in a capitalistic society would find himself with the limits of his own resource. He would find himself punished by the system if he cannot find something to produce, something to sell, something to trade. The problem is if you start rewarding people arbitrarily for just having needs, you end up rewarding the having of needs, and you end up rewarding everyone who can just beg more money or equal amounts of money while not producing for the rest of society a good output.
I would also be interested in knowing by what metrics JF is saying people beg for money or people can't work. Do we mean people with physical or mental disabilities would make it difficult for them to work, or is he referring to some sort of lazy gene? Also, what does begging for money have to do with the welfare state? Begging for money doesn't get you more money. That's not how the welfare state works. At all.
It sounds to me like you really have a problem with welfare, but you don't want to say it outright.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm totally fine saying it outright. I take issue with welfare. Do you support things like UBI and welfare?
Oh, God, wait, I'm sorry. I hate to run this down, but I was completely correct. We did end up just talking about welfare again earlier. All of the talking about income inequality doesn't matter because JF principally disagrees with the idea of people having, like, any kind of baseline subsistence, you know, like, worth to their life.
I absolutely support UBI, but I support real UBI, and that I think that we should be taxing those who make the most in society and using those taxes to be able to pay for those who can't work. And honestly, everyone, to a certain extent.
Now, do you realize, given that you seem to accept the theory of evolution and you seem to accept all of the basis that if you feed a family that makes more babies, you will have more of them in the next generation and more of their...
And again, I was right again! The specific reason he brought up evolution to begin with is because he wants to frame the conversation as though anyone who doesn't subscribe to his ridiculous pseudo-scientific eugenicist narrative has to be so delusional that they don't actually believe in the existence of human biology. He's trying to frame it as though the only way you can disagree with JF is if you don't believe in evolution. God, I hate how he says make babies instead of have children. I'm trying not to poison the well here, but JF has an unfathomably creepy history with, like, child rearing in a lot of ways. Some of the stuff that he said is beyond the pale, to say the very least.
Genes. Do you see the unsustainability of this system over evolutionary times?
So the problem comes in that more people are going to receive more food and make more kids. Is that it?
Exactly. And that ultimately you will find yourself with an infinitely growing population until you cannot sustain their needs. You cannot produce enough to sustain the needs that you've created.
Then what? Then why does population growth slow down the wealthier a country gets? Again, Lance needs to call this out. This is a very, very easy rebuttal. What? I hope he does, because this is an incredibly easy thing to point against. All existing data on anthropology and socioeconomics tells us that the argument JF is making here isn't just incorrect, it's the opposite of correct. The opposite thing happens. Yeah, this is an idiocracy tier argument. Anyway, we'll see.
Okay, so if I'm going to snap us back to reality, in our current system, we overproduce food. As a humanity, like as a species, we currently produce twice as much food as we consume. We throw out twice as much food. We produce twice the amount of food that we would normally be able to consume. So the problem isn't food production in any way. It happens to be distribution. And that is usually the case with a lot of things in our capitalist systems. So it doesn't go down to a matter of like how many babies are going to be able to be born at a given time if they're receiving a certain amount of food. It all comes down to the fact that we have certain systems in place that benefit certain people.
No, he didn't take the shot. Lance, you got to take the shot. You've got a kill shot.
say you snap back to reality, but really you slap back to an alternate reality. First, the surplus of food you mentioned, that doesn't matter. If you have created an infinite need function, you're going to reach a point at which you have people consuming all of this food.
Yeah, see, you have to attack the fundamental delusion that JF has, the fundamental one.
I don't think you've addressed the problem intergenerationally. How do we lead to a sustainable system in which yet we are creating infinite needs?
Yeah, but I mean, you keep going back to this. It sounds really eugenics-y, right? Like, ultimately, if I really...
No, so it is eugenics. He is specifically advocating for eugenics, but you have to reject the empiricism that he's trying to ascribe to his position. I'm not trying to be hard on Lance. I'm just supporting my friends, okay?
This down, it kind of sounds like poor people have too many babies. Is that a disingenuous?
No, that is exactly what he is saying, yes.
Reflection.
It's one way to phrase it. The thing is, as a capitalist, I don't even take issue with poor people having babies, as long as they have the ways to self-sustain their families and to deliver services to them. The problem is when you start taking from others to feed these families, then you are entering a relationship of theft, and that's a problem evolutionarily. And I don't hear a solution. You seem to be, your solution is, well, that's eugenics, and therefore I don't have to address it. The thing is, we've discussed the logical basis of what you call eugenics. You accept all of the series of facts and rational processes behind my conclusions, but you end by saying, well, I'll call it eugenics, and therefore I don't have to address it.
See, this is the argument he's going to make. You have to tackle the actual eugenics argument. He's saying, if you're born, if you're poor, you work or you die, and you'd better work hard, too. You get to have exactly as many children, and you get to live exactly as many days as your labor produces. Any less than that, you die on the street. And you'll be lucky if the state sends over, like, a caretaker to bury your corpse. That's the level that JF is at. You need to start breaking that position down, that set of arguments down, you know?
I would like you to address
Okay,
it.
sure. If you would like me to address this, yeah, the solution to like large population growth happens to be, both historically and from a scientific standpoint, the education and empowerment of women. So if you take any country that is developing and happens to have a large population growth, through the education and empowerment of women,
broader
of the
than
population,
that,
you will
but...
see a lowering of exceptional birth rates. So that's a solution.
This is true. This is true. I just think it's unnecessarily specific because now we're introducing another angle into it. Now we have to talk about the feminist angle. What he's saying is correct, and it is a counter-argument, but it's an introduction of another facet that can be challenged.
It already has, or say that's a problem that already has a solution.
I think it has a local solution in a bubble of time. And I will say you're totally right. When what you call education and empowerment, I tend to see it more as anti-reproductive propaganda, but okay, let's take your word.
See, no, this is exactly what I mean. By making it about women, JF can frame it as like feminism corrupting people into no longer having children. Because JF despises women. He is insanely misogynistic. So by making it a woman's thing, like all you have to say is, poor people produce more kids than wealthy people. Therefore, by your own logic, by your own system, depriving the poor of resources only leads to them spreading their dysgenic characteristics more fervently.
Education and empowerment. It's true that if you pass a perfectly fertile woman through the university system and you keep her eyes open in front of the professors and you get her through 10 years of her most fertile life into learning quantum physics, it's true that she's going to produce less babies. That being said, I don't think it's a sustainable system, because what you have as a reaction to this is simply people evolve away from going at the university. People evolve low IQ to avoid the university.
Wow. This is fractally wrong. People evolve lower IQ to not go to the university. By the way, this guy has a PhD in biology. I'm not kidding. This guy is actually more educated on this subject that he is talking about right now than all of us are. And if I remember correctly, he actually got kicked out of his university faculty program because of sexual harassment allegations from a bunch of his female coworkers. That's true, right? I'm remembering that correctly? I think this... Yeah, he did. Yeah. Evolution also doesn't occur on the kind of timescale he's suggesting. Also, average IQs have gone up with time. The Flynn effect, it's gone up with time, not down. How could people getting more educated lead to a general lowering of the IQ of the population? That's never happened in any country at any point in history. More people getting educated means people evolve to be stupider? How? What? This is like... So, the problem now is that JF has deployed the Giga Bomb, okay? This is a common argumentative tactic from people like him. He said so many stupid things in such quick succession that Lance is now stunned, okay? He's going to have difficulty thinking of how to format the 27 rebuttals that he can provide to that argument. Let's see how effective the stun is.
And I think that what we're seeing in our society is we've attained this peak. We have reached a peak of IQ, and now the high IQ people are really making too little babies. So what we're going to see in the next few generations is...
Wait, he's acknowledging it. Higher IQ make fewer babies because they tend to be more educated and they tend to be wealthier, which means they produce less children. His argument is self-evidently incorrect. He's actually providing his own counter-argument. Lance needs to jump on this.
Probably a decrease of IQ, a higher reproductivity of the lower IQ scales, and that's okay, you know. But it means that the system here is not sustainable. It's like you're not going to force people to go to university, or if you do, then you'll be committing an immoral act, in my view.
Nobody's forcing people to go to university. People choose to go to university because it leads to better life outcomes.
I kind of don't want to get too bogged down on IQ. I didn't think we'd be talking about that in a debate between capitalism and socialism.
Oh, hold on. If you're talking with JF, any debate is going to turn into an IQ debate, okay? That's like basic research before talking with JF. If you're out on a night in the town with JF and you're deciding which ice cream place to go to, you will end up discussing race realism before deciding which ice cream place to go to, okay? This is just par for the course with JF, all right?
To be totally frank, and I kind of think of it as astrology for incels. So maybe if you think that it's like a temporary solution.
Oh, I really don't like that. While it's true that the IQ discourse is like meaningless and stupid and often held by people with a pseudoscientific understanding of human behavior at best, I really don't like the outhand dismissal. Because he has a better immediate argument that doesn't sound like deflection. He can disprove JF's beliefs within JF's own framework without even having to like dismiss the broader set of ideas, you know?
To a problem, but it's one that bears out, and you just admitted that it bears out every single time that it's implemented. Why not continue to do the thing that works? Isn't that just the natural progression of this?
I mean, the thing is, something can work, okay, and it won't work over evolutionary times. There are temporary solutions.
So the rebuttal to this is prove it, because so far all existing history of industrialized countries have demonstrated the trends that I and Lance are describing. And he's saying, oh, no. On an evolutionary time scale, actually, it will lead to people evolving lower IQ. No. Like, okay, can I... Proof? Oh, you see in 1 million billion years. Like, yeah, no, okay.
Over evolutionary times that can work, but evolution by its nature is already fighting against it, and I think it's already what we're seeing. I think that you have high fertility in low IQ females right now. They are the reproductive elite.
Wait, again, he's doing it. There's high fertility in what he says low IQ. He means black women mostly, by the way, but like black or poor women. So the characteristics that he's describing as being associated with unproductivity are ones which also lead to higher fertility. So you would want to elevate them so they produce less kids, right?
And this is going to have impacts down the line. It's going to change our society. We're going to have a lot of stupid people, and that's okay. I actually have respect for low IQ people.
How hard do I want to poison the well on this man? Do I... Look, I'm not telling the whole story, okay? But JF has a history of going after like barely legal mentally deficient women. There was a court case he was once in where the state essentially proved that he was like manipulating and acting predatory and grooming this like 18-year-old girl who was a fan in his community. This woman, he wanted her to travel across the United States to make a baby with him. She was so mentally or cognitively challenged that she had never worked a job, she had always lived at the behest of her parents, she had never had sex, she had the mental age of a child. When the judge asked her to, like, add up numbers in front of the judge, she struggled to do so. She struggled to add, like, 2-digit numbers together. Her mental facilities were severely regressed. And since then, I think JF has made multiple comments on, like, how he likes mentally disabled women. I think he likes women who are stupider than him or something like that. He tried to steal her away from her family, and the judge actually ruled a separation or something like that. There's so many details to this, but he also has, like, a breeding kink, I think. He talks about how he wants to make babies with all women, but I don't think he has a single kid. I don't know. It always comes down to kinks, doesn't it? I don't know. Anyway, just the... I respect low IQ people. I'm sorry, I don't know.
But yeah, it doesn't solve the problem on the evolutionary scale. And I'm left thinking, well, capitalism has all of these solutions built in. And capitalism never even wanted to fix these problems. It's just that in the simple systems of consent, voluntarism,
Lance should ask JF if he can provide an example of a capitalist society that had low birth rates amongst its poorest population and higher birth rates amongst its wealthiest population.
and the accumulation of property, somehow the ingredients were there to make.
In 2014, he took research funding from Jeffrey Epstein, by the way. Oh, yeah! He got like $25,000 from Epstein at some point, a grant that Jeffrey Epstein was offering to some people, which is a pretty wild connection.
A human society that was arrimated enough to nature that it wouldn't fight against it. The problem with the projects you're proposing is that they are really all fights against nature. And we can get more in detail on the worker co-op, for example.
Sorry, hold on. You're partly wrong. It was a 19-year-old woman with a child's mind from Texas. He tried to take custody from the parents. Oh, yeah, he tried to take custody of her. Ugh. But failed. He went on Destiny's stream and talked about how it was love when he was called out about it. I remember that. It's love, you idiot. Yeah, that one. I remember that one. That one's the classic, okay? That's the run back.
That's another fight against nature. The fact is that the brains of people, of workers, have not demonstrated their fitness at managing the world, at managing their own companies. So why would I put them in control of the whole companies? To me, it looks like giving a very important decision to a bunch of people who haven't demonstrated their ability to make particularly good decisions. So that's why
I can address that.
So this is, of course, a post hoc justification. The reason why workers shouldn't be in control is because they're not in control. You can make the same arguments about feudalism, you know?
All right.
First off, I think your entire plan, you're basically just describing the movie Idiocracy. And then secondly, to workers working in, the means of their own production, having supervisors and stuff like that, those exist within every single one of the worker cooperatives and the big examples I was trying to give you. Those have hierarchies, but they are justified hierarchies in that if you are the CEO.
Man, I really, really wish that Lance had jumped in on the obvious self-defeating nature of his biological prescriptions. Maybe they'll come up in the future, but it seems like we're moving away from that. To a fan of JF, I feel like this position is going completely unchallenged, that Lance just didn't want to address it because he didn't want to, like, contend with eugenics, you know?
Of the company, you will only make between 5 to 8 times what your workers do, but you will justifiably have to do about 5 to 8 times the work that they do. Well, at the same time, at the end of the year, every year they get to vote on their board of CEOs. In that if you are a shitty CEO, or you're a CEO who's just basically embezzling money for your own enrichment, then you will be removed effectively, which would be a much better system, a much more democratic system for every single person who's working for these companies, instead of the dictatorships that we have now, which is basically every major corporation in the US.
The problem is that Lance is being a little bit too inflexible here. Lance doesn't want to talk about the IQ stuff. He just calls it incel astrology. He admits he wasn't really ready to discuss it. He wants to talk about socialism v. capitalism. But for JF, every single debate comes down to eugenics. That's every conversation you're going to have with the guy. So it's just a matter of preparing for that and being ready for those talking points, you know?
Well, I agree with some of what you say. First, the CEOs doing embezzlement. Yes, there are dirty players in capitalism, and there are forces that are to be criticized, and they make our world less productive. I'm just not sure that even a worker co-op can stop this kind of system of corruption. I'm just not sure that the people has any insight that would allow to fix these problems. Ultimately, the worker is just one component in the whole ecosystem of a company. Why don't you have customers co-op or providers co-op? Why is a company being defined by the people who are giving work hours to it only, when in fact the company is a system of ins and outs, of demands and requests and offers. That is...
Well, I mean, why not offer it to Yelp reviewers too? At the end of the day, you should offer it to every single person who's involved in the company in some respect. Yeah, well, that's asinine nonsense. You have to have it with the people who work in the company themselves. That's what workers owning the means of production do. They're the ones who actually produce the products. Otherwise, there's no point in involving outside. You can take outside influence. You should take feedback as a company, but ultimately, you're the one making the products that people buy.
So I think, again, one of the issues here is that since socialism is economic democracy, something that Lance pointed out, JF doesn't really care about democracy, so it's really difficult to sell these arguments on him. I mean, like you can talk about like the value in giving workers control over the place they work at and that kind of stuff, but I don't think it's ever actually going to sell with him. Man, it's really tough to make those arguments. It feels like you always have to go back to something more fundamental, you know? Political movements build on each other. It's easier to make pro-socialist arguments to a capitalist than it is to a feudalist, because a feudalist would reject the idea that human beings deserve democracy altogether. They're one step behind, essentially. Since JF doesn't value democracy, it feels like there's more work that has to be done. But I don't think that's something that Lance can necessarily fix. That's just a difficult thing to contend with in general.
Yeah, but all I'm pointing is that the unit of making the product is a very arbitrary unit. Ultimately, there's work that's been going on into the parts that were bought by the company. So why don't we give control of the workers that produce, say, the car wheel drive? Why don't they control the company that makes the car? Well, it seems like it's pretty arbitrarily divided on, well, these guys are spending 8 hours in this building or that building. Capitalism has resolved this by offer and demand and price at the moment of trade on a voluntary basis. So you really can do anything. But once you buy the wheel drive, you can make a car with it. And you don't.
So this actually has nothing to do with socialism. Saying that our economies are complicated and that commodities are traded between different industries and companies in the production of a greater product, that has nothing to do with democratic control over an existing industry. All you would really have to do is say, hey, all the existing companies right now, as they're currently formed, are now democratic. They're now worker cooperatives. Bam. The trade chain, the line of production, has nothing to do with that process. So I think that this is JF's attempt, whether conscious or not, to introduce unnecessary complexity to give Lance more non-arguments to contend with. It's admittedly an effective strategy, so we'll see.
Don't need to know anything else, then this is the price of a wheel drive. And if you're not happy with that price, you can go to another company and get it from them. Why would we give control and decision-making power to units that have really shown nothing else than just an interest into renting their body for 8 hours to a given entity? To me, it strikes me as unnatural and potentially leading to failure. That being said, as I said at the beginning, I'm all for worker co-ops to be given their chance. I just don't think it's going to be a particularly good way to manage.
Why do I hear this argument all the time from people who don't actually have arguments against worker cooperatives? Oh, all the data says worker cooperatives are super good, huh? Well, I doubt it. I mean, I don't really have a problem with worker cooperatives. I just don't think they'll work. And, like, as long as you don't force them. But, like, you can do them if you want. Also, there's no systemic bias against worker cooperatives, so the fact that they aren't already super popular is evidence that they were never going to work. And that argument has never been used in bad faith against any other thing that later became popular. But, you know, I don't have anything against them. I'll just argue against every single premise of their existence without actually committing to it because I'm not willing to engage with the data. Well, I get this so often from people. It's just an intuitive rejection that I hear against worker cooperatives. They're not comfortable with it, but they don't actually have anything against it.
A company.
So they've already been given their chance. There's already like a wide body of data that we can use to see whether or not they've been efficient within the marketplace. Now, again, I don't know how many times I need to reiterate this. They are not directly going to be in charge of all decision making. You will have to have people who are superiors, people who are going to manage teams. The difference being is that those people can be voted out if they're not performing adequately. That's basically it. And at the end of the day, why would a worker want to have any involvement in a company, even though he's just kind of like a flesh meat sack there for exploitation? Because I think fundamentally, every single person should have skin in the game. It'll make them better employees. I mean, the results speak for themselves. Every single time people who are involved in worker cooperatives are polled on this, they report better job satisfaction, better involvement. They're more encouraged to work in the job because they're actually being involved in the products they're making.
I've seen these studies. I find them extremely focused on single domains and extremely limited. I think that if you were to build an entire society where like 50% of the whole economy is in worker co-ops, I think you'd start seeing problems that you wouldn't detect in these studies. That being said, you know, again, worker co-ops should be let to exist. They can exist without problems in the capitalistic system.
Oh, man.
So in the case of the Italian region I was telling you about, 1/3 of all the businesses in that region are worker cooperatives. So we have an overwhelmingly large data set to be able to like pull information from. And it's been showing itself time and time again to be more efficient than its counterparts and as well produce higher job satisfaction for the workers.
All right. Well, if people are happy in Italy doing that, they should keep going. Now, the efficiency of democratic system. Do you realize that you're pushing for a system in the workplace that is absolutely unsatisfactory in terms of how it manages our politics, for example, because we have democratic politics.
See, this is what I mean. He doesn't actually believe in democracy, so trying to make arguments for economic democracy aren't going to sell with him or his audience. He doesn't. Well, the economic democracy works, I suppose, but democracy in general isn't exactly the most effective system.
Do you realize that? Are you satisfied with the way our politics is turning out?
No. Wait. The correct response to this is Lance. Okay, Lance should not answer that question because it's not the right question to ask. Lance should say, "Are you suggesting demolishing democracy would produce better outcomes?" That's the only thing Lance should say here. By answering the question, he's going to be running down a very bad faith premise. Sure, there are problems with how democracy works, but I prefer democracy to autocracy.
No, but that doesn't have anything to do with the fundamental principle that I think every person should have a vote in democracy. Like, just because I don't enjoy if Donald Trump gets elected doesn't make me think immediately that I should just abolish democracy like that.
Okay. You should challenge him too. Are you saying then it'd be better if we just were ruled over by a king? By the way, doesn't JF have the flag of the French monarchy flying in his background? All right.
I don't think that there's any reason why we should skirt into something like authoritarianism or fascism just because we don't like the results of the election.
Okay. That was a perfectly good response from Lance.
Well, I certainly don't.
Oh, that's the flag of Quebec? That's the provincial flag of Quebec? Same thing.
Do not advocate for authoritarianism. But what I note is that the transfer of authority that happens when you create a democracy is to take what you found was immoral if done by a dictator or a single individual, and to suddenly find it moral when it is imposed by the mob. There is a fundamental problem in that
the language that he uses here, imposed by the mob. It is immoral for a dictator to tax the people, but if the people vote on taxes, that is the same. Again, he doesn't believe in, well, funnily, this describes both his politics and his sexual relationships. He doesn't believe in consent. He doesn't actually believe in the concept of consent. He believes in the concept of individual autonomy for himself, but in terms of, like, the idea that something is made better if people decide they want it, that doesn't apply to him. I don't think he, like, understands.
All of the authoritarian things that you seem to criticize within the current structure of hierarchy in a capitalistic company, you just want to delegate this authority to the group. Why is it better
so they can
when
vote
the
on
authority, the same authority with potentially the same oppression onto the individual, is suddenly transferred to a wider group?
Notice how he said potentially the same oppression. That potentially is doing a lot of work there. The correct argument, of course, is that while democracies don't always produce outcomes that Lance agrees with, they're a system that is more likely to produce good outcomes, which is why democracies tend to be way better and way more humanitarian than authoritarian governments.
Well, if you're using the parallels of politics, that's the same problem, right? Like, why is it better if someone, say a fascist, has complete authoritarian control over his people, which is the current paradigm we have of corporations? With corporations, we have small amounts of boards and CEOs. Their only responsibility is the fiduciary responsibility they have to their shareholders. All the decision-making is made by them, and it can affect millions and millions of people sometimes. So that is a fundamental problem. I think we should expand democracy into those companies so that everyone has a say in what involves their lives.
But for example, don't you take issue with the fact that people have voted across the years drug laws, and that ultimately it is the people who is oppressing drug smokers and putting them in jail?
So
again, this is Lance just has to say, because JF can do this forever. Well, don't you disagree with this one rule? The democracy brought about. Lance has to say very, very flatly, drug smokers, by the way, that while democracies do not always produce outcomes I agree with, it is a better system more likely to produce outcomes I like than an authoritarian government.
If you want to talk about the history of drug prohibition, a lot of it is centered around racism in the United States, particularly to vilify Black and Hispanic people.
No,
and
this
one
is
of the problems with that is
tangential.
it's propagated through the U.S. system and then spread worldwide. Its racist origins do not in any way think to me that it makes it okay that was permitted for so many years. There was a huge amount of money spent on fear-mongering and scapegoating individuals so that everyone in society ended up thinking that drugs were bad. That's where that all comes from. And this goes back to a big problem we have with the capitalist system. Under a capitalist system, if you have capital, you have power. So the more capital you have, the more power you have to basically change society as a
I don't think Lance realizes that JF is fundamentally arguing against democracy. He's not arguing... The argument has moved past capitalism and socialism. It's moved past worker cooperatives. We're now specifically discussing, singly discussing, whether or not democracy is valuable.
whole. So that is a fundamental problem to me, because you have individuals who will have a lot of accrued capital, a lot of accrued power. They will be able to influence politics. That's the bigger problem I find with liberal democracy in any way, shape, or form than I take with the very fundamental idea that everyone should have a democratic vote.
Well, I think that you're making my point here, because you're talking about people and you're demonstrating a case in which they were.
Yeah, he kind of is. JF's argument is that democracy doesn't produce better outcomes than authoritarianism, and Lance just argued on his behalf that yes, under a democratic government, capitalism does lead to the inequitable or unethical production of some policies.
Driven into a bad vote, a vote that I guess you disagree with. Do you disagree with the drug laws as they've been enacted and applied in the US?
Oh yes, no, of course, absolutely. Yeah, I think that drugs should be legalized. But that doesn't change the fact that, again, under the system, it is those with capital who will be able to exude power over politics, who will be able to influence politics, either through lobbying or other coercive methods. There's a huge entrenchment with both the prison industrial complex that required a large amount.
See, look, it's happening right. JF is saying democracy isn't better than authoritarianism, and Lance is saying, okay, but our system could be more democratic. It's not actually answering the fundamental challenge that JF is producing.
Of people to be fulfilling those empty seats when it comes to prisoners. Like this whole thing is like you're opening up.
Also, chat, wake up, Jesus Christ.
Huge can of worms in terms of like a different topic, but that doesn't change the fundamental principle, again, that I believe that everyone should have a democratic vote. Like, did you not think that? Do you not think that democracy should exist?
I think that democracy is an aberration and a violation of individual rights.
Yeah.
I recognize that there are some things in society, like the gathering of trash, that may need some kind of collective system, and perhaps democracy is this imperfect system that could allow us to determine the schedule of trash collection. But ultimately, I think that democracy is an authoritarian regime, putting the authoritarianism into the hands of the mob. And so I reject democracy as a whole.
So what is your alternative? So you were the one who's ultimately advocating for authoritarianism, not me. Ironically. No,
I'm not. I'm advocating against authority. I do not think that a group of X million people should have authority over whether I smoke drugs or not.
Yeah. So how do you manage politics then? Do you just want to abolish the state? Are you going for
yes, I'm basically a minarchist. So I think of the state as a kind of small operation that should remain less than 1% of the economy, that should just handle whatever really can't be handled by the rest. But I'm for the abolishment of most of this.
So I want to say JF basically lies about his positions to bait people into making statements that he can say, oh, well, actually, you have not actually defeated my position. I am even less democratic than you expected me to be. I feel like Lance should have seen this coming. It's clear that Lance wasn't ready for him to go this far over, but there were earlier signs. You always want to go to the root level of whatever argument the person you're debating is actually making. And JF has essentially been making anti-democracy arguments for a while now. So you have to jump right at that as quickly as you can, Otherwise, you're going to waste a bunch of time, and then you get to it later,
State. And as far as the control of whatever is left, there could be democratic components to it. But what I ultimately believe in is a super strong constitutional order that essentially keeps this democracy from growing into the kind of authoritarian nightmare that it has grown into right now.
So I am assuming you're essentially an anarcho-capitalist, which means you're a cartoon character. And ultimately what that means is that you would have to justify unjust hierarchies, right? That would be the idea of what an anarchist is. Any unjust hierarchy, the burden of proof is lying upon them to justify that hierarchy. That's exactly what the definition means. In your society, then, I assume the rich, the incredibly wealthy, would just be the ones who had access to everything they needed, like hospitals, schools, education, and those who were unable to accrue wealth or survive in that society would just have to die by the wayside.
I don't take issue with people dying if it must happen, and in fact, everyone.
Yeah, see, this is the problem. Lance was under the impression that he was arguing with a normal human being, but tragically, he is not. He is arguing with JF. JF is one of those lunatics who believes that if they lived in Ancapistan, he would be one of the reigning warlords, and not one of the people to be ground into the dirt by people with actual, power.
Dies. That being said, you say that I justify unjust hierarchy. No, to the contrary. There is an unjust hierarchy right now, as you've said it yourself, in the fact that a mob of people can have decided that for the last 100 years, we were arresting the people who just decided to smoke drugs for themselves. I believe that this is an unjust.
So the natural response to this is, what if all of the corporations that could hire people for work have drug tests, and they won't hire you if you smoke drugs, because they want people to be as stable as possible when they work there? How do you redress that? What if corporations just want to have drug tests?
Just hierarchy, and I'm defending the opposite, an absence of hierarchy or a presence of hierarchy in those cases where it is consented to by the individuals.
So in your ideal scenario then, in this like ANCAP wonderland, what exactly takes place? Like, how do people govern themselves? Like, how does someone have access to a hospital? How does someone have access to a road if the government itself is not even building the roads?
Well, we can talk about the roads, and I think that the roads would be like they were before the governments took them over, which is that most roads have been built by the people who live on them and are then sold to the government.
What?
Most roads are actually private entities that have been handed to the government just for the maintenance function. As far as hospitals, they would follow the law of the.
I don't know if this is the case in Canada, but no. Governments have been building the roads. I don't know if Canada has some weird exception to this, but no, governments have been building the roads pretty much forever, okay? Of course they have. Yeah, all these cities and communities just privately built modern asphalt roads that capable of withstanding heavy traffic and trucks? What?
Demand and offer. So if you're a doctor, you're selling a service. If there's not enough people buying your services, then your hospital is not worth existing. It will disappear eventually because it doesn't make enough profits. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you could have in these societies superb systems of health insurance, but you may not also. It all depends on what people need and what people are willing to pay. And ultimately, the free market will be what determines what exists.
So the challenge that Lance needs to make to this is not to start poking holes in Ancapistan by arguing all the ridiculous, stupid hypotheticals that children might come up with to explain how society would work in such a system. What Lance needs to do is he needs to start pointing out that corporations would have more of a control over your life than anybody else would. Like, what if corporations decided that they wanted to annex huge swaths of territory and keep you living on a company town? What if no drugs were allowed on that company town? Then JF would say, well, actually, the Constitution would prevent this behavior. And then, okay, what if instead corporations built company towns and said that all of our products cost 3 times as much unless you live in the company town, you get a discount. And you have to sign a contract to live in the company town that cedes your right to certain things. And then everyone moves to the company towns because corporations control all economic output, and then you're essentially being beheld to a more strict set of laws that would have existed beforehand. All of this has already happened before. How is that not poking holes? The holes that need to be poked are specifically on corporate control of behavior. We want to focus on the democracy authoritarian aspect.
I don't know where you read that. Like, I've never heard someone say that all roads were built privately and then bought to the government, but on average, roads are usually paid for by the government itself through taxpayer dollars and then established and built. And yes, the roads would then turn over to, I guess, people in the ANCAP paradise, but that doesn't mean that the, let's just say, development of new roads would ever take place without some kind of social funding. Like, you have to understand on some level, unless you happen to be wealthy, Or, I mean, outside of that, in your ideal scenario, everyone would be left by the wayside. Like the poorest individuals in society wouldn't have access to healthcare. They wouldn't have access to education. They wouldn't even have.
See, I don't think this is a good argument because JF has already said specifically that he does not give a shit about poor people. So there's really no point in trying to appeal to his humanitarian impulses.
Access to toilets.
Access to toilets. I think that toilets are, I mean, people are buying their own toilets today. They're building their house and they're putting a toilet in it.
Yeah, if they're not homeless, because if they're homeless, they're not building a house at all.
Well, yeah, if they're homeless, the opposite of this is to say that someone who's homeless is entitled to have a house builder work for them. And so who's the authoritarian here? Well, it is Lance right here, because he's telling us that you are empowered to compel the house builder and the doctor and the hospital to serve this homeless person who has nothing to offer to them. So the reason I care about...
So this is a very common libertarian argument. If you say that people are entitled to health care, you're forcing doctors to provide them health care. That's slavery. No, it's not. That's part of the job description of being a doctor. That's part of the job description of being a construction worker. That's how jobs work. You do the job. You have roles to fulfill in the job. You have to do the job roles.
Sustainable system is that ultimately Lance's system is unsustainable, authoritarian, and consists in ultimately the forced labor of a bunch of people who shouldn't be forced to work, or if he has them not through forced labor, if he doesn't force the doctor to cure them and force the house builder to build a house for them, he will be essentially forcing them through printed money or debt or government intervention, which will be another kind of force and another kind of theft.
Yeah. So in terms of building houses for the homeless, it's statistically been proven. You don't have to do it from a moral standpoint, but it actually saves your society money at the end of the day. It costs an overwhelming amount of money to police and to hospitalize people who are homeless, whether they have a drug addiction or they are, perceptible to crime or things like that. So ultimately...
Yeah, because he wouldn't say that you police them or anything. He would probably just say that, like, you would exile them out of the town or something. Like, ANCAPs have responses to these arguments. I can tell that Lance probably wasn't, like, expecting the debate to go here and didn't have much in the way prepared for it.
Yes, building houses would be something that would reduce the amount of crime and reduce the amount of
just
burden
let them die.
Your hospitalization system. On top of which, we currently live in a current paradigm right now, the capitalist one, the one that exists, in which there are a very small amount of people. In this case, it happens to be 6 individuals who have the collective wealth of 7 billion humans. So we have a gross disproportionate disparity of income redistribution. And a big problem with that is that they are not being used to put that money towards anything of good. Like, I know a lot of the money is obviously going to be in shareholder value. I'm not trying to say that it isn't. But if we have such a huge concentration of wealth into the hands of the very few at the expense of everybody else, there should be more equitable systems. That's what I'm advocating for. Like systems that work better for every single human. You don't even have to do it from a humane perspective. It just works from...
Now he's doing it again. He's appealing to humanitarianism. Yeah, this is so I don't blame Lance for this because you need to be really, really, really familiar with debating a lot of wacky people. And Lance has debated a good number of people. I'm not saying he hasn't. I'm just saying that this is about, you have to understand where the other people are coming from. JF doesn't care if people starve and die. You knew he was an alt-right figure coming into this. You shouldn't have expected much in the way of humanitarianism. So you shouldn't be making humanitarian arguments. JF and his following have already convinced themselves that there's some sort of racial genetic elite that need to seize society back from the degenerate, non-white, like, low IQ filth that are plaguing our societies, okay? That's what's going on in their head. So when you're criticizing their arguments, going to empathy-based, retorts just isn't going to work with them. You have to you have to focus on how his system would be in its own way authoritarian. Get him to trip up, get him to stumble on his, how he would defend his existing system, point out how childish it is, but you have to nail it on the right positions because he doesn't care about being a psychopath.
Like, better from a societal perspective.
Well, I don't think there should be a more equitable wealth distribution, and moments of the past where we have seeked this more equitable wealth distribution have led to societies that have just not produced as much beauty and as much wealth and as much productivity for everyone as those who are more capitalistic. That being said, on the question of...
what does that mean? I don't know what that means. More capitalistic societies provide more beauty than less, historically? And the more capitalistic societies are the ones without welfare states? It's pretty incoherent.
the homeless and saving the homeless can benefit society. We never really get the final count on this, because if we got the final count, you could just start a business. You would start a business in saving homeless, and you would cash in on it. We never really quite get this. We get
what's the profit motive? What's the profit motive for that business?
You would essentially get them out of homeless status, and you would have
the burden that the homeless people provide is to society itself. It's going to be in the amount of money that you as society have to spend on hospitals, on policing, stuff like that. So there's no profit incentive for a private company to come in and solve that.
Well, then we enter another domain, which is if the homeless are costing things to society because they're committing crimes, and you say that it becomes an economic gain because you will keep them from committing a crime, then you're essentially getting extorted by a bunch of criminals. And we cannot, as a society, have organizing principle that say, we're going to pay you not to become a criminal, because you're beginning the extortion here. It's like, how many people, how much are you going to pay for just keeping them off the streets, as we say? And there's no...
Again, this is what I mean. JF's worldview is that the poor and the low IQ are just burdens on society that need to die. You will never be able to make an affirmative argument for equality from this guy.
And to it, again, it's an unsustainable system.
What do you think causes crime?
Causes crime? What causes people to eat and consume pornography and do ABC? It's the human brain. The human brain causes crimes.
So the answer is poverty. Poverty is typically the most common precursor to crime. And it makes sense. If you don't have money to feed yourself, or you happen to be addicted to drugs, you're probably going to turn to crime to be able to feed yourself or get yourself those drugs. So it has nothing to do with some kind of innate probability. There's no gene for poverty that exists within the human genome.
You don't know that.
See, this is what I mean. You can't make humanitarian arguments with him. Every argument you make, he's always going to boil it back to the underclass is genetically inferior and we're better off without them. You arguing against that, it's just he's going to circle in circles, and you'll have to argue actual genetics with him. And by the way, I've argued genetics with JF. He lost. Unfortunately, the video from when I debated him is before Tempest was my editor, meaning that we don't have timestamps here. But yeah, the debate that I did with him on race realism, he folded like a house of cards. This guy is not like biologically educated, really. He has a PhD, but I mean, he's one of those arguments against academia being an inherent qualifier, right? Somewhere in this hour and a half, I don't even have his camera up here. That sucks. Somewhere in this hour and a half is an explicit discussion on race realism where he folds on all of his positions.
Or if it's a lesbian couple,
Okay,
like they
so
would have been artificial. But how is that? I mean, here in the United States of America, most of the immigrants in this country are Democrats, which means they're actually increasing the total amount of freedom in this country.
Genes. It selects genes. It favors certain genes. Then the question becomes, you essentially want to create a biodome. You're a social engineer. You want... Do you think, for example, that if there was a gene, and let's bring it to the theoretical domain so that we can agree, and then let's bring it into the real domain.
Sure,
if there was a gene that makes you totally unable to become an engineer, let's say that you have no spatial brain, you are unable to make mathematical calculation, do you think that this gene would influence your socioeconomic position in the world eventually?
If you're asking me if like a certain race of people have a gene that literally like cuts off a third of their brain, then yes, obviously this would lead to material differences in their participation in society. But I reject preemptively any argument you're going to make that the reason why black people are poor in this country is because their lower IQs and bumpy skulls led to them living in ghettos.
Okay, well, that is a straw man, but I think you agreed with...
It's not a straw man, because later that's the argument he ends up making.
As much as I want to convince you that socioeconomic... Well,
I wish I could... My mic sounds so much better now than it used to. I wish I could,
I would disagree with this statement. There are some academics, Edward Dutton...
Liberal society. You claim to care a lot about liberalism, or at least liberty as a concept.
Yes.
Yeah. So I feel like your interest would be building a society in which people have the maximum amount of freedom to pursue their desired life states, no?
Yes, but with a caveat, which is that there are certain freedoms that ultimately deny other freedoms. And so everything is a balance.
Dictatorial will.
Really commit to a full attack and
Really astounding. Yeah, well, wait, wouldn't this work out in your interest though? Because if I take my
and the
argument.
natural state. Yeah, well, then we agree. The problem is there is currently a social pressure being put.
I just wish I could find the exact. It wasn't that. The funny thing is with JF, normally like the race realism stuff is the whole argument, but he got like shut down in like 5 minutes, so it's only a tiny portion of this. Is it here?
Agree the best thing we can do is try to meet environment. We can reduce the production of that trait. It's that trait factors can also it wouldn't sell anemia.
How long do I talk?
And so in my view, the entire world is a mix of genetic influences and influences that come from outside the body.
It goes both ways, though. It goes both ways because genetic factors can also be a product of your environment. That's why IQ doesn't actually determine general intelligence, because if it did, it wouldn't change when you get an education. That's why West Africans have the sickle cell anemia shit. It has nothing to do with their African genes. It has to do with the environment they lived in. When they got shipped over to America, they got that trait was removed. A genetic trait no longer exists in a population because the.
So I think I was a little bit imprecise with my language here. Genetic may have been the wrong word to use when I was talking about IQ, because IQ is not a genetic trait. It's one that we very much socially arrived at. But the point that I'm making here is that a lot of the things that we think are inherently tied to race are really just a product of circumstances that are pretty easy to change. The expression of sickle cell anemia in West Africans that were brought over to the US because they were slaves went down significantly. Part of it is because of, interracial breeding, and part of it is just because the environmental traits that required sickle cell anemia no longer existed.
The environment is no longer there to incentivize the production of that.
Oh, I can make it go wherever I want.
That trait. It's reciprocal, and that's what makes this research so difficult, right? That's why nobody can make like any hard causative arguments. But if you want, we can reduce this down to like moral claims. If you agree that environment affects genetics, which you would have to, wouldn't you agree the best thing we can do is try to meet environmental parity so everyone has the best possible chance to maximize their genetic potential?
Absolutely interesting. I agree that the environment influences the genes because the theory of evolution essentially says that. I'm a biologist and I believe in it. So yes, the environment evolves genes. It selects genes. It favors certain genes. Then the question becomes, you essentially want to create a biodome. You're a social engineer. You want to change the world by equalizing the environments.
Yeah.
I don't think it follows from the fact that the current environments are that white people and black people are responding differently to the United States environment. We could frame it that way, frame the problem that way. I don't think it follows that if we equalize the environment, we will equalize the genes.
Well, we have to test that, right? Like, we can't know for sure unless we actually introduce racial parity. Hey, listen, I'll tell you, we can undergo that experiment together. Hey, listen, if you're interested in finding out the extent to which racial differences are genetic, and I'm interested in racial equality, the best thing we can do is get rid of racism, because that would A, clear up any confounding variables for your research, and B, make me happy because it would lead to a greater general increase in happiness.
This is one of the arguments that I think is most effective against race realist types, because it's technically true. If you were interested in proving that black people and white people are inherently different with regards to their IQ, the best thing you could hope for would be an environment where there are no environmental factors to play into a difference.
Like, we should share a goal in that.
Very interesting. And I have to say, this is one of the most productive discussions I've had with a leftist.
Is it? Oh, man. There's... where's the saved transcript on this? No. Where's the... Open transcript. Hold on. Oh my god. I've never actually looked at this before. I didn't realize this was a feature, actually. Wow. Huh. Not even an app or an add-on. That's just something you can do. What was the, I don't know what I'd be looking for here. Ah, whatever. We're wasting time. Anyway, I think that with JF, it always comes down to biology and IQ arguments, so you always got to be ready for those.
Okay, is that what you're proposing? You've discovered the poverty gene? Is that where we're at?
No, because genes don't work that way. It's not a poverty gene or a homosexuality gene. The problem is that the human genome is a complex entity, and some of it makes you more likely to be intelligent, less likely to be intelligent, and down the line, in the causal influence of thousands of genes, you may have paths that lead to more likely criminality or less likely to be criminal, or less likely to be poor or more likely to be poor. There's definitely polygenic studies that show genetic correlation with wealth, genetic correlation with IQ and educational attainment. So the answer to your question is almost yes. It's just not one gene. It's 1,000 genes.
Isn't this your field of study?
Yes, I'm an evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
Guys, what did JF actually study, by the way? Didn't he study the evolutionary biology of, like, eels or something? It wasn't humans that he studied. He studied something else. Yeah, it was eels. JF Gariepi, Wikipedia. Scientist. He studied biology. Yeah, about the neural networks involved in the respiratory rhythm in lampreys. I don't think he ever did research on humans. Yeah.
Yeah. So why is your understanding of this so cartoonish? Like, I can't wrap my head around the idea that you think poor people were genetically predisposed to being poor.
Well, I will let people judge who's more cartoonish between the guy who has no training in biology and asks for the poverty gene and the other guy who does have training in biology and who informs you that we have correlations between genes and poverty and IQ and educational attainment in the 1,000 counts.
Well, yeah.
So again, this is a fallacious appeal to authority for one, because JF Gariepi hasn't actually substantiated or even really defended his argument that that there is a poverty gene. He essentially said there's a poverty gene, and then Lance said, "You really think there's a poverty gene?" And then JF said, "No, actually, there are many thousands of genes which combine to make poverty happen. You moron, you idiot." But he hasn't actually like substantiated that position. So
I mean, they'll have to judge between a clown on the internet who makes jokes for a living and someone whose actual academic field of study is in this very specialization.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, Lance shouldn't be engaging with the appeal to authority here. Like, there are plenty of retorts that you can do here. Like, if this is your field of study, then why is it? Can you explain to me then why there isn't published research on like a prescriptive causative relationship between genetics and poverty? Or you can. He also. I feel like there were a lot of missed opportunities in this debate. He didn't really challenge Lance appropriately on the fundamental hypocrisy of his belief that allowing the poor to starve would mean they would produce fewer children. And he didn't really challenge JF on the inherent authoritarianism of his minarchist society. And now he's not really challenging JF on the irrationality of the positions that he's delivering right now.
I mean, do you have an argument? Because I can pull the studies. We can get into the Nature papers that look into the meta-study of all twin studies. And the thing is, do you have an argument, or do we have nothing here?
Yeah, I do have an argument. According to the International Monetary Fund, as well as numerous studies on what is the causal link between poverty and crime, it's almost always established that crime is a precursor. Poverty is a precursor to crime. Like that has been established time and time again. I've yet to see anyone propose the fact that there is a genetic link for people becoming poor outside of maybe the bell curve.
But you could also make the argument, this is the argument that I made with JF, even if there was a genetic component to certain elements of poverty, which you could probably find associations there, no doubt. For example, there are genetic components to being black, and black people tend to be poor. But that doesn't mean that because they're black, that means they're poor. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a causative relationship. There's a correlative relationship. The causative nature would have to be determined by further research. And so far, it hasn't been determined. So what Lance should really be doing here is saying, okay, sure, you can say there's a genetic component, but there is undeniable evidence that environmental outcomes significantly determine the likelihood of a person or a group of people becoming poor. So why don't we work to address those environmental outcomes? And then JF would have to go on the defensive and say, I don't think it's worth it because that's extortion, et cetera, et cetera. And then Lance could say, what if you could procure better social good by making sure that everyone is well off enough that there isn't a bunch of crime and suffering than you could by simply allowing that crime and suffering to happen? There has never been a society in all of human history that has managed to just ignore the consequences of poverty. It's never happened. Why do you think yours is different?
Well, you can get into Nature papers and you type genetic correlation between GWAS studies and twin studies, and you'll find genome-wide association analysis of risk tolerance and risky behavior. That's one that's more specialized. I would have to find the one that gives all the answers that you want. But there's definitely genetic correlation between the genes, on the one hand, the twin studies establishing the polygenic influence of genes, and all of the factors we've talked about. Now,
notice he says correlation rather than causation. Causation is what you'd be looking for there, right? But he's saying there's correlation. Correlation is very easy to find.
Do you ever realize that it's not because there's a correlation between poverty and criminality that this correlation is not ultimately explained by genetic influence?
Well, yeah, but I think the idea between correlation and causation there, I mean, you're doing the heavy lifting on the other part, right? At the end of the day, if it's poverty that is going to be the precursor to crime, then those who are impoverished most likely will have lower test scores on whatever like quotient you're trying to give them. They'll have lower IQ scores, obviously, because they are embattled in poverty. That wouldn't surprise me to find that out. That's not an indicator that somehow they're genetically predisposed to being poor. Like, I've never heard anyone suggest that there happens to be a genetic coding that makes people impoverished.
Well, you can go look why evolution is true. The blog, they have a post recently called How Much...
The other correlation causation error that's taking place here is that you can believe two things simultaneously. One, you can believe that some people are poor probably because they have some genetic propensities that lead to poverty. Like maybe you could argue that there are genetic components to mental illness, and that tends to lead to poverty because it's harder to operate within a capitalist society. That doesn't mean that poverty is explained by genes, though. Just because some people might be poor due to some genetic factors, disability can be a very common one, for example, doesn't mean that poverty as a sociological phenomena is explained adequately by genetic differences. So those two things don't necessarily follow.
Variation in human behavior is due to variation in our gene. Answer, quite a bit. And so the reason you've not been exposed to these ideas is that you've been presumably hanging out in social circles of leftism. There is seriously no scientific question today that the genes influence all of the factors we talked about: criminality, IQ, educational attainment, wealth. It's definite. The definite answer is yes, and you'll see the links to the original peer-reviewed study in that blog post.
Are we going to talk about capitalism or socialism at all?
Oh, I don't like this from Lance at all. He didn't really provide any challenges, and then he lets JF get off like a big, perceived rebuttal, and then he's like, let's get back to the topic. It's too late, Lance. You're already here. You have to respond to it once you're here, you know? Once you let the conversation get this far into you've already made counter-arguments, too. If JF just went off on this random IQ tangent, and then immediately afterwards you were like, can we get back to the actual subject? That'd be one thing, but Lance engaged with the genetics arguments for a bit, but now it looks like he's kind of conceding.
Is that going to be on the menu? Or?
Well, we're still talking about...
Now JF is going to jump on him for what looks like a concession.
That's the important thing, is that we're talking about these issues because if evolution applies to humans, and it does, and if genes matter to behavior, then socialistic systems, welfare systems, UBI systems are unsustainable over evolutionary times. That is my point tonight. And all I hear is ad hominems, insults, jokes, a guy who recognizes himself that he's a comedian on the internet. I was expecting more.
Yeah, fair enough. I was not, so I've been basically met with exactly what my expectations presented.
Yeah, this retort doesn't look very good after all that. There were a lot of points that JF brought up that Lance just did not have a response to. So for Lance to posture after that, it makes him look delusional.
I'll say this though, when it comes to all those problems and what exactly is the causal link and what exactly is going to create, let's say, more poverty in society, ultimately you would want to see less, right? I'd assume.
Less poverty?
Yeah, less poverty. You like to see more equality, right? More people living
No, he specifically said he didn't care about equality as a construct.
their best lives, I would assume.
Not necessarily, I take planet Earth as what it is. When I look at a population, whether it's of animals, of plants, or of humans, I don't see something that must be manipulated towards something better because of my taste. I don't have that kind of narcissism to think that my preferences over the world should overtake it. I see it as a natural system that will develop and that will either sustain or not sustain. And so when I look at humanity, I'm fine with our past, for example. If I look at the human population 1,000,000 years ago, I can imagine that they were living kind of rough lives. And I don't take issue with this. I'm fine with what we are. We are animals. We come from populations of apes, and we are subject to evolution. I'm fine with everything we've went through. And sometimes I think that in what we think is an advance, we are actually directing our societies toward systems that should not be adopted, and that we should, yes, return to a state that is perhaps more poor, but more in line with nature.
I mean, from my perspective, I think if we both agree that humans evolve over time, so do economic systems evolve over time, then we should be taking the aspects of those economic systems and then utilizing what works the best and then trying to improve our lives and the lives of everyone around us, because ultimately...
No, again, JF doesn't care about improving people's lives. Lance doesn't seem to... I don't know how much experience Lance has arguing with, like, anti-liberals, but he doesn't care about improving people's lives, fundamentally. If you want to challenge JF's arguments, you have to challenge them under the premises that Lance has made himself. Or, sorry, that JF has himself made. And the easiest points to attack here are that JF's prescriptions about welfare are self-demonstrably false, and additionally, that the system he advocates for would severely reduce human freedom, which is, and it's easy to make those arguments if you're used to arguing with ANCAPs, but arguing for equality, to an average onlooker, this comes off like a deflection, and to a JF fan, this looks like Lance is just a pie-in-the-sky delusional leftist who isn't really willing to engage with the harsh reality of hierarchy and how the world works, which is only reinforced by the fact that Lance seemingly conceded the evolutionary or genetic arguments earlier by saying, well, can we get back to capitalism v. socialism?
It's not even from like an egotistical thing. It can be from a more like selfish reason. I think everyone's lives are better when everyone is collectively thriving. The more poor people there are, the more people who are like suffering on the street, the less quality of life you or me is going to have. I mean, the more crime that there's on the street, the more problems everyone else is going to have. If you improve the lives and the conditions of everyone around you, then we will also live better lives.
That's one way to see it. There were poor times in the past of my great-grandparents that sometimes I think it was still a better time and a better world. So it's not all about wealth, definitely. And there are desirable things of societies of the past that got abolished by the current eccentric lifestyle and the over-perfusion of wealth and money in the system.
By eccentric lifestyle, what he's referring to is degeneracy. That there were good things back in the trad life days, and now degeneracy has taken it away. That's what he's referring to there.
And I'm fine with poverty existing. I don't want to combat it, because when you start combating it, you start entering the game of unsustainability, the game of feeding the birds, feeding the squirrels. And to me, that's a dangerous path to take.
I don't know where we move from here, James. Do you want to go to the next section?
Yeah, we've been doing this for like 2 hours. I feel like that's the gist of the argument right there. The problem is, I feel like the main flaw here, and I'm not saying, by the way, that like JF argued his positions brilliantly, because he didn't and he doesn't. I think the main problem is that Lance doesn't seem to be either familiar with, or wasn't expecting, or wasn't prepared for dealing with like a eugenicist's argument, The fundamental arguments made by a person like JF aren't going to appeal to equality. They're going to make a bunch of inaccurate statements on the nature of the world and the nature of human genealogy and the nature of hierarchy. And then they're going to justify abhorrent political systems based off of these presumptions on how human beings naturally work. And you have to be ready to challenge that on their own premises. Vaush, but will his fans move over their points? No. Lance's fans will not move over to JF's points because JF made the same mistake in the other direction. JF did not make any arguments that would appeal to a person of Lance's political disposition, and Lance didn't make any arguments that would appeal to a person of JF's political disposition. The reason why I still think that's a little bit of a loss for Lance is because Lance's positions are inherently more justifiable than JF's. If you're both coming off looking equally incapable of appealing to the other, and it's an argument between JF and the normal human being, that's a loss for the normal human being. Does that make sense to everyone? Lance just has too much faith in humanity. Well, no, it's difficult to contend with these arguments because JF is so outside the Overton window that, like, I don't think most people are inherently prepared to talk about that kind of stuff with him. It's important to remember that, like, sometimes you have to drop positions, not drop positions, you have to move past positions that you never even thought you would have to move past, you know? You guys remember, in some of the arguments that I've had with Nazi types, like, rather than, like, arguing for the importance of equality, like, I'll jump to the position they're at. We're talking race realism? Okay. We're talking the JQ? Okay. I'll hit you on those points. But you need to dig at the root, because otherwise, to their side, it's only ever going to look like you're trying to posture by sticking it, like, your border, keeping it your wall. It's really important to go in there. How do you feel about JF's statement about feeding the squirrels? Because personally, make me big. JF's a monstrous person, but I knew that coming into this. I don't know, like, to what extent my audience does or whatever. You know? To what extent to jump in there. I guess I'm not sure. I just think it's not important to draw the distinction between someone that obviously authoritarian. Those fans won't care anyway. Jay the One Skate, if you believe that, I don't know why you watch me. My whole point is that I'm willing to engage in the types of arguments lefties won't touch because I think I can pull away people from the alt-right. And I've been largely successful at it because it is possible to make those arguments. And by the way, I've gotten emails from people after my first debate with JF saying, okay, I've started watching you after your debate with JF. I used to be a fan of his. You can do those things. You just have to know how to make the arguments. And it's not easy to do that. I'd say the main failure here on Lance's part is just an unwillingness to really dig in the dirt with the type of arguments that JF would pull you to. Because it was supposed to be a capitalism versus socialism debate. But it never, ever, ever ends up being like that with JF. So, you know, whatever. Oh, anyway. No haterino to Lance. I don't think some great social harm has been done. It's always a learning experience with this sort of stuff. And it's also important to remember that what I'm doing right now, analyzing the debate after it's happened, is way easier than actually doing it live in the debate. Always, always, always. Every time I debate somebody, every time, I always go afterwards. I think, you know, oh God, I could have done so much better here, so much better here. So it's always harder to do it live in person. You see your chat flying by, people are saying this and that, and you're debating a person who's speaking at you live. You don't have time to think, whereas I can pause the video to say something. I can take a moment to, you know, reflect on a point. Whereas in a debate, you always have to be responding. You can't, like, stop for 10 seconds and then come up with a response. So anyway, keep that in mind. Anyway, yeah, I love you all very much. Those are my thoughts.